was cold with bright lights hanging from above, and the smell of metal mixed with medicine filled the air. A human soldier sat on a low chair, his hands tied behind him, and his left leg wrapped in a rough bandage already stiff with blood. His face should have been pale with pain, but instead he wore a calm smile, like someone waiting for a bus. Commander Saren of the Vash stood in front of him, her armor polished dark blue and her eyes sharp with authority. She had broken many prisoners before, and she believed she understood the rhythm of human weakness. They always cracked with shouts or bargains or silence when the pain rose too high. She lifted a rod from the table, a simple weapon of weight and force, no hidden current. No chemical trick, only the strike of muscle and steel. The guards beside her tightened their grips, one with a carbine pointed at the prisoner's chest, another ready to hold him steady. Saren lined her strike and brought the rod down against the wounded thigh. The sound of impact filled the room, heavy and wet. For a heartbeat, silence followed, and she waited for the scream. But instead the man's head tilted back and then forward, and a low chuckle broke from his throat. He laughed fully, the sound echoing around the walls, and he looked at her with steady eyes. "Do it again," he said, his voice steady, not mocking but calm, as though asking for another drink at a table. The guards exchanged looks, one shifting uneasily. Saren's pride tightened her jaw. She struck again, harder this time, the bandage splitting as new blood oozed through. He hissed for an instant and then laughed louder than before, a laugh that seemed to live in his chest, not forced but real. That laugh unsettled the guards, and even the walls felt thinner for it. The guard behind him muttered about damaging the leg, but Saren ignored him and studied the prisoner more closely. She saw scars on his arms and sun marks across his jaw lines carved by a hard life. He looked ordinary, like a farmer or a worker, but his eyes were too sharp to dismiss. "Why do you laugh?" she asked, her voice low. He shifted his shoulders, the chains clinking with the movement. "Because fear tastes worse than pain," he said. "Pain is honest, fear is a liar. I prefer honesty." The words sat heavy in the room, and the guards looked at each other, one of them almost smiling before catching himself. Saren felt something stir inside her that she refused to name. She ordered the medic to scan his wound. The medic hesitated, then stepped forward, his lens flickering with readings. Torn muscle, no bone damage, blood loss within limits. He looked nervous, as though unsure what side to stand on. "Treat him after," she said sharply, and the medic retreated. She leaned closer, trying another angle. She spoke his squad's names, his home station, his mother's village. Each word meant to dig under his skin. For a moment his smile faltered when she named his sergeant, but then returned stronger. He told her, "You already know where they are, or you would not hold their names. You want me to scream so you can say victory came from my weakness? I will not give you that lie." The silence after was thicker than before, broken only by the hum of the station systems. A siren wailed somewhere far away, then faded again. She tapped the floor near his boot with the rod, not striking his wound this time, only marking space. His eyes softened for the first time with a flicker of respect, and that unsettled her more than his laughter. "What are you made of?" she asked quietly. He breathed deep and answered, "I am made of a land that kills the soft and raises the stubborn. I am made of long winters bitter. Food and jokes told at graves. I am made of people who hold the line, and when it breaks they draw a new one with their bones." The words were simple, not shouted, not proud, only spoken like truth. They rested in the room like an unseen companion. Saren felt the guards shift behind her, their thoughts turning to families far away. She thought of her younger sister drafted to the fleet, and her chest tightened. She placed the rod back on the table and told herself she would break him with method, not anger. Because admitting the truth forming inside her was more dangerous than failure. She ordered water for him, and the guard hesitated before obeying. The human drank slow, then looked at her. "Thank you," he said, as if they were sharing a meal. Then he tilted his head and told her, "When you struck the second time you leaned wrong because your knee aches." Her breath caught because it was true, and she hated that he saw it. "I notice things," he said. "It keeps me alive. Notice this pain will not help you. Choice will." The siren wailed again, louder this time, and the hum under the floor grew rougher. The lights dimmed. Emergency power. Something had changed outside these walls. The human leaned forward, chains rattling. "Do it again," he said, but his eyes were not mocking anymore. They were waiting for her. Decision. Commander Saren dismissed the guards after the siren faded, leaving only herself, the human, and the low hum of machines that kept the room alive. She told herself she needed silence to focus, but the truth was clearer than she wished to admit. His laugh lingered in her mind, and it unsettled her more than the alarms ever could. She sat across from him again, watching the steady rise and fall of his chest, the way he looked at the room like a man surveying the horizon, instead of a prisoner locked in chains. He did not look broken, he did not even look strained. He looked aware, alive, and ready. She tapped her fingers against the table and reviewed his file once more. The records painted him as nothing exceptional. A soldier pulled from a colony known for harsh storms and long winters, trained in survival schools, where food was scarce and pain was routine. Yet in those lines she began to see patterns that disturbed her. For her people, pain was a tool that bent bodies and cracked minds. But for him it seemed to be an anchor, something that steadied rather than unbalanced. That thought grew heavier the longer she looked at him. She remembered her own first winter training on the Vash homeworld, when icy winds had cut across the barracks, and even the instructors had cursed. She remembered how her comrades had begged for warmth and how she had buried her pleas under layers of discipline. But this human, he had embraced the cold and made it part of his laughter. She asked him, "Where do you come from?" and he answered simply, "From a world that does not care if you live or die, and so you learn to care for yourself and for those beside you." She asked if he feared death, and he shook his head no. "I fear failing those who trusted me more than I fear pain or silence." His words were not grand, yet they felt heavier than speeches she had heard from admirals. One of the guards at the door shifted uncomfortably, and Saren noticed it. She dismissed them with a flick of her hand, wanting no witnesses to the strange crack forming in her own resolve. Alone now, she leaned forward and asked, "What makes you so different?" He smiled faintly and said nothing. "Makes me different, I am only human, and that word carries more weight than you think." She tried other tactics, reading his record aloud, speaking of captured villages, burned outposts, and her own fleet's victories. She expected anger or grief, but he only listened, his expression calm, like the words passed through him instead of cutting. When she asked him why he laughed when struck, he answered, "Because laughter makes the pain mine and not yours." She could not stop thinking about that. She struck again, testing her theory. His leg trembled, but he met her eyes and let out a sharp laugh again. She knew then the rod was useless. His strength did not live in his muscle, it lived in something deeper that could not be cut with wood or steel. For a while, neither of them spoke. The hum of the failing systems above grew louder, the siren distant but steady. The war outside was moving closer. She asked him what he thought was happening beyond the walls, and he answered calmly, "A push, a counter-push, a storm rolling in. You hear the sirens, but I hear the timing. Soon this station will feel the war at its doorstep, and then you will have choices to make." She bristled at his calm tone, but deep inside she knew he was right. Already the facility trembled like a beast stirred in its sleep. When she pressed him again about his squad, he shifted the talk. He spoke of a boyhood spent in forests where predators prowled and storms tore down trees. He spoke of learning to run barefoot on frozen ground and how every lesson was a battle, but every laugh was a victory. He spoke not to boast, but to explain how pain had become his companion, not his jailer. As he talked, she saw flickers of her own youth buried under armor and discipline, and it unsettled her. At one point he studied her closely and said, "You are not cruel by nature, you are bound by duty. You strike because you are told to strike, but I see the way your eyes move when you say the names of my squad. You know what it means to lose someone." Saren stiffened and told him he knew nothing about her, but inside she felt the truth in his words. Her sister's face rose in her mind, and she pushed it down with force. He tilted his head and said softly, "That is why you hesitate. That is why you wonder what choice means." The lights flickered again, this time staying dim for longer. Emergency power routed elsewhere. She realized the station was under stress, perhaps from battle, perhaps from sabotage. Either way, time was slipping. She stood pacing the floor, her boots echoing in the empty chamber. The human watched her with calm patience, as though he knew she wrestled with herself more than with him. She turned sharply and asked, "What would you do if you were free?" He answered, "I would save who I could and fight if I must." She pressed harder, asking if he would kill her if she cut his bonds. He looked at her and said, "No, not unless you forced me to." That answer dug into her chest like a hook. For the first time since the war began, Saren felt unsure of the story she had been told about humans. They were supposed to be wild, dangerous, uncontrollable. Yet this man in chains seemed more controlled, more certain than anyone she had ever met. His laughter was not madness, it was conviction. The hum beneath their feet deepened again, and distant thuds vibrated through the walls. The war was coming closer, and the room seemed smaller for it. Saren gripped the rod but did not swing. She felt the weight of her own choices settle heavy on her shoulders. The human leaned forward, his voice steady and low. "Pain will not bend me, Commander, but choice might bend you." His words rang true in her ears, and she realized, with unease, that the battle was no longer between soldier and prisoner, but inside her own heart. The lights in the room flickered again this time, not returning to full brightness, leaving long shadows stretched across the metal walls. Commander Saren stood by the table, her fingers tight against the rod, but she did not lift it. She could feel the weight of her own silence pressing harder than any question she had asked. The human sat there, chained, his wounded leg trembling, but his eyes bright and alive. He had become more than a prisoner to her. He had become a reflection of something she could not name but could not ignore. She paced once across the room, her boots thudding with a rhythm that matched the deep vibrations rising through the floor. Somewhere far above, heavy engines roared and distant weapons fired. The war was not outside anymore, it was moving into the bones of the station. She turned back to him and asked if he knew what was coming. He nodded calmly and said, "Battles do not wait for permission. They arrive when the world decides." She told him that his laughter unsettled her soldiers, that it made them doubt themselves. He gave a faint smile and said, "Then you should thank me, because doubt is the first honest thing they have felt in this war." His words cut sharper than the rod could ever strike. She stepped closer and lowered her voice, asking why he pushed her to this edge. He answered, "Because you are not cruel, you are curious, and curiosity always leads to choice." She hated that he was right, because she could feel the edges of her loyalty bending. She thought of her sister again, the one dragged to the fleet against her will, and wondered if laughter might have saved her too. The human shifted his weight, the chains rattling, but he kept his tone steady. "You think torture brings truth, but all it brings is noise," he said. "Truth comes from what people decide when they have no reason left to lie." She stared at him and for the first time felt the full force of his humanity. Not just stubborn flesh, but a mind that could turn pain into a lesson. He had taken her weapon away from her, not with strength, but with will. Suddenly, the door to the chamber burst open and one of her junior guards stumbled inside, his armor scratched and his breathing ragged. "Commander, the outer ring is under attack," he shouted. "Enemy forces breaching the dock levels." Saren ordered him to seal the inner corridors and prepare the squads, but the guard hesitated, his eyes darting to the human. He asked in a low voice, "What about the prisoner?" Saren paused too long, and that pause revealed more than she wished. The human saw it and smiled again, but softer this time. The guard left to carry orders, and the door shut, leaving them in the tense quiet once more. Saren turned on the human with narrowed eyes, demanding to know if his allies were behind the assault. He shook his head and said, "My people fight hard, but not always with brute force. Sometimes storms arrive without our call." She wanted to believe he was lying, yet something in his tone told her he spoke plain truth. Outside the walls, explosions rumbled closer. She felt the choice he had spoken of inch nearer. She sat across from him again, her voice quieter than before. "You are in chains, yet you speak like you hold the power," she said. He replied, "Chains mean nothing if your spirit is unbroken. The moment you believe the chains own you is the moment you are lost." His words hung heavy, and for the first time she could not find a retort. She felt the strange tug of respect building inside her, a dangerous seed. Then he leaned forward, his eyes sharp. "You have two paths, Commander," he said. "You can hold to your orders and break yourself against them, or you can choose differently and find something greater." She demanded to know what greater meant. He smiled faintly through the blood drying on his cheek. "Greater means survival, not only for you, but for those you care about. You know the war is spiraling. You know loyalty alone will not save your people." His words twisted deep inside her, because she had felt the same unspoken thought growing for months. The admirals claimed the war was just, but the casualties grew each week and the reasons grew thinner. She clenched her fists and told herself he was trying to weaken her, but the truth was she had already been weakening long before he arrived. He had only given her reflection a voice. The hum in the floor became a shudder, as if something massive struck the station hull. Dust trickled from the ceiling vents. She looked at the human and saw him steady in his chains, as though he had expected it. She asked him what he would do if she cut him free right now. He said, "I would not waste the chance. I would fight for those still breathing. I would not kill you unless you forced me." That promise was not loud, but it struck her heart harder than any oath she had heard from her own fleet. The door rattled again, with muffled shouts echoing from the corridor. The battle was close. She realized her time was ending. She turned back to the human and asked why he laughed at pain but not at death. He answered, "Pain is living, death is the end. I laugh to remind myself I'm still here. That is why it unnerves you, because you feel the same but cannot admit it." Saren stared at him long and hard, and for the first time she did not see a prisoner. She saw a mirror. She saw someone who had chosen to live unbroken even while bound. She felt her resolve tremble like the walls shaking under bombardment. And as the alarms wailed once more, she realized that the battle was not only for the station outside. It was for the space inside her own chest where loyalty and doubt now clashed like armies. The roar of distant explosions shook the chamber again, this time harder than before, as if the very bones of the station were being tested to breaking point. Commander Saren braced herself against the table, her eyes fixed on the human, who still sat bound yet calm, as though chaos was an old friend to him. His wound bled freely through the torn bandage, but even so he sat upright, shoulders squared, his gaze steady. She wondered if anything in him could ever be bent. She wondered if she herself was already bending. The door opened sharply and 2 guards rushed in, weapons drawn, their armor smeared with smoke. They reported that the docking bays had been breached. Enemy vessels were inside and resistance was collapsing. Saren gave orders to hold the inner defenses, but she could see in their eyes the weight of failure. One of them dared to ask again, what about the prisoner? Saren hesitated, her silence growing longer than it should. The human watched her with that unsettling mixture of calm and amusement. She finally told them to leave him secured and return to their posts. The guards obeyed reluctantly, their faces marked by doubt. As the door shut, she turned back to him, demanding to know if he had expected this assault. He shook his head slowly and said, "Wars have their own rhythm, Commander. You only think you can control it. Sometimes survival means listening to the storm instead of pretending to master it." She hated how his words seemed to make sense. She hated more how her heart was beginning to agree with him. Another shudder rolled through the walls, making the lights flicker and shower a few sparks. A panel in the ceiling came loose and clattered onto the floor with a sharp ring. Dust drifted down, catching the thin light. The human tilted his head, watching it fall, and said, "Storms bring down more than structures, they bring down lies too." She asked sharply what lies he meant. He answered, the lie that cruelty is strength, the lie that obedience is honor, the lie that fear can hold a people together. His chains rattled as he shifted his weight, but his eyes never wavered. She felt the words settle inside her, heavier than the thuds of battle outside. She tried to silence them with the authority drilled into her since youth, but they clung stubbornly to her thoughts. She remembered the day she was taken into the fleet, the day her sister had been dragged away with her. She remembered how the officers had told them the war was for survival and glory, yet all she had seen since was loss. For years she had hidden the cracks, but now a prisoner in chains had exposed them in hours. Louder blasts shook the chamber, knocking one of the lights from its fixture so it swung on its cord, throwing jagged shadows across the walls. The door burst open again, but this time it was not her guards, it was a young technician, pale with fear, clutching a scorched data pad. "Commander," he stammered, "the enemy is moving through the inner ring. They will reach this level in minutes. The Admiral demands that we hold, but the defenses are falling." Saren ordered him to return to his station, though she knew it was hopeless. The boy nodded, but his eyes lingered on the human, as if wondering if he was more dangerous bound or freed. Then he ran. When they were alone once more, the human leaned forward, his voice calm but edged with urgency. "You have no more time, Commander," he said. "Soon they will break through that door, and you will have to choose whether you cling to chains or to life." She spat back that freeing him could doom her people. He replied, "If you leave me bound, you doom them anyway, because the storm will not wait." His words struck her harder than before, because deep down she knew they rang true. The walls shook again, this time with a deep hollow boom, as though something massive had struck the hull close by. Emergency lights flared red, painting the room in a bloody glow. Saren stood frozen for a moment, staring at the prisoner. He met her eyes not with mockery, but with something quieter, respect, perhaps even pity. That unsettled her most of all. The chains rattled as he shifted again. He said, "You have been taught to see me as a monster, but tell me, Commander, when you look at me now, do you see a monster? Or do you see someone who refuses to bow?" She wanted to deny it, yet the truth burned too brightly. She saw a man who had endured everything she had thrown at him and still laughed. She saw the reflection of something she wished she had kept in herself long ago. The sirens screamed louder. The lights dimmed further. The door groaned under distant impacts. She gripped the rod one last time, then dropped it onto the table, the sound ringing out sharp. She stepped forward and studied the chains. He waited without a word, trusting her silence. She reached for the release, but her hand trembled. She pulled back, cursing under her breath. He spoke gently. "Choice does not come easy, but it always comes." Another explosion tore through the corridor outside. The door bulged inward with the force. She knew the battle was now at her threshold. She looked at him one last time and whispered, "If I free you, will you fight beside me?" He answered, "I will fight for survival, for anyone willing to stand, not for vengeance unless forced." That was enough. She slammed her hand onto the release. The chains fell away, clattering onto the floor. The human rose slowly, his wounded leg shaking but holding firm. He stood taller than she had expected, his presence filling the chamber. For a moment she felt fear, but it was quickly drowned by something else, a strange surge of relief. He flexed his hands, the blood drying on his skin, and looked at her with steady eyes. Then the door cracked again and smoke began to curl through the frame. He turned his head toward the sound and grinned. "Time to see if laughter survives the storm," he said. Saren tightened her grip on her sidearm and nodded. Together they faced the door as the war came crashing in. Smoke poured through the cracks in the chamber door as if the station itself were bleeding. The alarms wailed without pause, and the air carried the sharp scent of scorched metal. Commander Saren steadied her sidearm, her eyes fixed on the buckling door, while beside her the human stood free for the first time since his capture. His leg was still wounded, yet he held his balance like a man rooted to the earth. He flexed his hands as if testing the air, then glanced at her with a grin that seemed reckless but also steady. She wondered how a man could bleed and still look like the storm belonged to him. The door gave way with a screech, and two Vash soldiers stumbled inside, their armor dented, their eyes wide from the chaos outside. They froze when they saw the prisoner unbound standing tall beside their commander. One raised his weapon but hesitated as Saren barked a sharp order to hold fire. Confusion flickered across their faces, but obedience still clung to their bones. They reported quickly that the inner ring had collapsed. Enemy forces were cutting through every defense line, and the Admiral was demanding a last stand in the central command spire. Their voices shook with fear, and it was clear they no longer believed in victory. The human stepped forward, his chain marks raw on his wrists. He spoke with a calm authority that made the guards lower their eyes despite themselves. He said, "If you fight to the last without thought, you will only add your bones to the wreckage. But if you think, if you choose, then maybe some of you will see another sunrise." Saren watched her soldiers shift uneasily at his words. She saw in their eyes the same doubt that had been growing in hers. One of them muttered that the Admiral would execute them for disobedience. The human answered, "Execution means nothing if you are already dead in a burning corridor. Live first, then decide what punishment is worth." The guards looked to Saren, searching for clarity. She gave them none. Her own heart was at war, and she could not speak until she understood which side of herself would win. The human turned his gaze to her. He said, "You already know your Admiral sent you to hold a line that cannot be held. You know he will sacrifice every soldier on this station to protect his pride. The question is not if you obey, the question is how many lives you are willing to see buried under that pride." His voice was not mocking. It was quiet and heavy with truth. Another blast shook the corridor outside, and the walls trembled. Saren made her choice not with words but with action. She ordered the soldiers to fall back with her to the maintenance shafts that cut under the command spire. They hesitated again, torn between her authority and the image of the unchained human standing calm in smoke. Finally they obeyed, following as she pushed open a service panel and led them into the narrow dark. The human entered last, moving with surprising strength for a man bleeding from the thigh. In the confined space, his presence filled every shadow. They moved through the shafts, the noise of battle muffled above them. Saren felt the weight of each step pressing down on her. She had freed a prisoner, she had given him voice before her soldiers. She had begun to act not as a commander of the Vash, but as something she could not yet define. She feared what it meant, and yet she felt lighter than she had in years. The human whispered directions at times as if he knew the rhythm of battle better than the walls themselves. At one turn he warned them to stop, and a moment later, enemy boots thundered across the ceiling overhead. He had felt it before they heard it. When they reached a junction, one soldier asked what the plan was. Saren opened her mouth and closed it again. For once she did not know. The human filled the silence. He said, "The station will fall, but there are still civilians locked in the lower bays. Save them and you save more than soldiers, you save the meaning of this fight." The guards looked at Saren again, and she knew the choice was hers. She thought of her sister pressed into service without care for her life. She thought of the human's words about choice. She gave the order to divert toward the bays. They crawled through another shaft and dropped into a corridor half collapsed from bombardment. Fires licked at the edges, and the air was thick with smoke. They pressed forward, weapons ready. At the far end, civilians huddled behind overturned crates, their faces pale with terror. When they saw Saren and her soldiers, they shrank back, expecting the cruelty of command. But then the human stepped forward, lifting his hands in peace, his voice carrying calm through the haze. He told them, "We are leaving together, no one left behind." They stared at him in disbelief, but the steadiness of his tone pulled them to their feet. Saren felt the strange shift again inside her. Her war had been about orders and obedience, but here before her were frightened families who had no place in war, yet had been dragged into its maw. The human looked back at her with a nod, as if telling her silently that this was the true test. She gave the order to protect them, and for the first time her soldiers followed without hesitation. As they guided the civilians toward the escape shafts, another thunderous blast shook the station and the lights died, completely leaving only the glow of flames. The human moved forward with calm surety, guiding people through rubble as though he had walked this path before. Saren realized he carried himself not as a prisoner or even as a soldier, but as a leader. And as she followed him through the smoke, she felt the chains around her own heart begin to fall away. The corridors leading to the lower bays groaned with every tremor, as if the station itself resisted survival. Commander Saren pressed forward through smoke and falling sparks, her soldiers forming a loose perimeter around the cluster of civilians they had gathered. The human moved at the front, his wounded leg stiff but unyielding, his step steady and deliberate. He carried no weapon, yet his presence felt like a shield stronger than the rifles in her soldiers' hands. Children clung to their parents' faces smeared with soot and fear, but when their eyes fell on the human, they seemed to draw courage, as if his calm spread to them like fire through dry wood. They reached a collapsed section of corridor where debris blocked the path. Saren ordered her soldiers to clear it, but the rubble was fused metal and broken plating, impossible to move quickly. The civilians murmured in panic, the sound rising toward chaos. Before it could break, the human stepped forward, placed his hands against the largest slab and pushed, not as if he expected to move it alone, but as if showing the others it could be done. His voice rose firm and unwavering, saying, "Together we are stronger." Hesitation cracked, and within seconds the soldiers and even some of the civilians added their strength. Slowly the rubble shifted enough to open a narrow gap. One by one the civilians crawled through the space, and on the other side they were greeted by a rush of fresher air. The human pulled himself through, last blood dripping down his thigh, but still smiling faintly. Saren caught herself watching him more closely than she intended. His laugh earlier in the interrogation chamber had unnerved her, but now his steady presence did something stranger. It reassured her. She realized with quiet shock that she trusted him more in this moment than she trusted her own command structure. Her thoughts drifted to the admiral waiting in the spire, ordering soldiers to die for ground already lost. She wondered how many more lies she had obeyed without question, and how much blood had been spilled because of them. As they moved again, another explosion ripped through the station, hurling fragments across the floor. A support beam crashed down, separating Saren and the human from half of the civilians. Fire roared up between them and screams filled the corridor. Without hesitation, the human limped forward through the smoke, ignoring his wound, and reached the trapped group. He lifted a young boy with one arm and shouted for the others to follow, his voice cutting through the chaos like a beacon. Saren watched him shield the civilians with his own body, guiding them back to safety, even as sparks burned holes in his torn uniform. She had seen soldiers fight with fury and desperation, but never had she seen one carry such stubborn determination, not for conquest but for others. When they regrouped, Saren ordered her squad to secure the emergency hatch leading to the bay levels. The lock was coated but failing from power surges. The human stepped up, his hands moving across the panel with surprising skill. He explained in a calm tone that his training had included bypassing systems not for sabotage, but for survival when caught in storms that damaged colonies. Within moments, the hatch clicked open and the group spilled inside the stairwell leading downward. Saren stared at him, realizing that every skill he carried had been born of hardship, not privilege. He was not a weapon forged by command. He was a survivor shaped by a world that refused to coddle him. Down in the bay levels, the chaos was worse. Fires spread unchecked and enemy troops clashed with desperate Vash defenders. The civilians froze at the sight, but the human raised his voice, telling them to stay low and move when he moved. He advanced first unarmed but unafraid, his eyes fixed on the enemy line. Saren raised her weapon, ready to cover him, and for the first time she felt not like she was guarding a prisoner, but like she was following a leader. Her soldiers sensed it too and shifted formation around him rather than her. They cut through the edge of the skirmish, guiding civilians into side tunnels while the human moved with uncanny precision, anticipating enemy movements before they appeared. He would point to a gap and moments later the corridor would clear, as if the battle bent itself to his instincts. One soldier asked in a whisper how he knew. The human only smiled and said survival teaches you to listen not just to sounds but to the silence between them. By the time they reached the docking bays, Saren's heart pounded not from exertion, but from the weight of realization. This man who had been her prisoner mere hours ago was now the axis of survival for everyone around her. She wondered what her superiors would call it, betrayal or weakness. Yet when she looked at the faces of the civilians clutching their children and the soldiers who no longer looked lost, she knew the answer did not matter. What mattered was that lives were being saved because she had chosen to release him. At the edge of the bay, they found several old shuttles damaged but intact. The human examined them quickly and declared that 2 could still fly if fueled and patched. Saren ordered her soldiers to begin repairs while civilians were guided aboard. The human moved among them offering words of comfort, not grand speeches, only quiet, steady assurances that made them believe. She stood back watching him, her mind a storm. She had been taught that humans were reckless, dangerous, incapable of discipline, yet here was one who carried more discipline in his wounded body than she had ever seen in a fleet officer. As the repairs began, a comm unit crackled to life with the voice of the Admiral, furious, demanding to know why she had abandoned the spire. His words were sharp, calling her traitor, threatening her with execution if she did not return. She held the unit in her hand, frozen. Then the human stepped beside her, his voice low only for her. He said, "You already know his orders mean death for everyone here. The question is not whether you obey, but whether you live with what comes after." His words slid into her chest like steel, and she realized the truth. Her loyalty had already shifted. She cut the comm without replying. She turned to her soldiers and gave the order to finish preparing the shuttles. None of them protested. In their eyes, she saw the same reflection she felt inside, the weight of choice now lifted by conviction. And as the human limped toward the cockpit of the first shuttle, grinning, despite the pain, she felt the strange certainty that his laughter had not only survived the storm, but had carried them all through it. The docking bay echoed with the pounding of boots and the hiss of fires as Commander Saren stood with her. Soldiers and civilians gathered around the battered shuttles. Smoke curled toward the ceiling where cracks in the plating leaked thin trails of atmosphere. Time was nearly gone. The human climbed into the cockpit of the first shuttle, his wounded leg dragging, but his movement steady. He brushed a hand across the controls, testing them like an old mechanic checking a stubborn machine. When the engine lights flickered and then hummed to life, relief rippled through the crowd. For a brief moment, the sound of a ship ready to fly was louder than the war around them. Saren moved to the second shuttle, directing her soldiers to fuel it and reroute power. One of her guards turned to her with a question heavy on his tongue. "Commander," he said, "are we truly leaving without the Admiral?" His voice carried the fear of treason. Saren met his eyes and answered with words steadier than she expected. "The Admiral has chosen pride over survival. I choose life." The guard hesitated, then saluted her, not as a reluctant soldier, but as one who understood her decision. She realized then that loyalty could shift not only in her, but in those who followed her. The human returned from the cockpit, limping heavily, yet smiling faintly. He gathered the civilians around him, speaking quietly so all could hear. He told them this storm would pass, as all storms do. He told them to hold on, not to fear the noise or the fire. His words were simple, yet they filled the space with courage more than any order Saren had given. She watched the children clutch their parents with less fear in their eyes, and she knew his voice carried something her fleet had never given them. Hope. Suddenly the bay doors shuddered with the force of an external blast, and a section of the wall buckled inward. Enemy troops surged in weapons ready, their armor glowing in the firelight. Panic spread through the civilians, but the human stepped forward, raising a discarded rifle. He should have been too weak from his wound to stand firm, yet he held the weapon like an extension of himself. Saren shouted for her soldiers to hold the line, and they formed a wall of fire between the civilians and the enemy. Blasts lit the air and smoke thickened, but the human's laughter rang out sharp and fierce as he fired. It was not the laugh of mockery, this time, but the laugh of defiance, one that carried across the chaos like a beacon. Saren found herself fighting beside him there, shoulders almost touching as they cut down wave after wave of attackers. Her soldiers fought harder than she had ever seen, not for the Admiral, not for orders, but for the civilians and for the chance of survival. Even the civilians themselves began to move with purpose, helping drag ammunition boxes, stacking cover, and pulling the wounded back to safety. The human had turned fear into action. He had turned strangers into allies. At last the enemy numbers thinned, leaving only smoke and silence broken by groans of the injured. The human lowered his weapon, breathing hard blood soaking his leg, but his eyes still burned with life. He looked at Saren and said, "It is time to go." She nodded, giving the order to load the shuttles. Civilians hurried aboard and soldiers secured the hatches. Engines roared louder, filling the bay with vibrations that rattled teeth but promised escape. As the first shuttle lifted from the ground, enemy reinforcements burst into the far side of the bay. Saren cursed under her breath, but before she could act, the human limped to the ramp of the second shuttle and turned back to face the oncoming troops. He raised his rifle once more, standing tall in the glow of the fires. His voice carried across the bay, calm and unyielding. "Come then," he shouted, and his laugh followed a sound as sharp as the blast of a gun. The enemy paused for just a moment, unsettled by that laugh, and in that pause, Saren ordered the second shuttle to lift. She grabbed the human by the arm, dragging him inside just as the ramp closed and the ship rose from the bay. The shuttles burst into open space, the stars vast and cold around them. Behind them, the station burned, collapsing into itself as enemy ships closed in. But the shuttles flew fast, engines screaming against the void. In the cockpit, the human leaned against the console, guiding the vessel with one steady hand. Saren stood beside him, her soldiers and civilians crowded behind them. For the first time in years, she felt something. She had forgotten the sensation of freedom. When the shuttles cleared the enemy perimeter, the civilians erupted into cheers, their voices echoing through the cabin. The human sank back into the chair, finally letting his body show the weight of his wound. Yet even then he laughed softly, shaking his head. Pain had never beaten him, and now neither had war. Saren looked at him long and hard and asked why he had kept laughing even when she struck him in chains. He answered, "Because laughter reminds me I still belong to myself. If I let pain own me, then I am already lost." His words struck deeper than any order she had ever followed. She realized that in freeing him, she had freed herself too. The Admiral's commands no longer bound her, the lies of obedience no longer chained her. She had chosen, and her choice had saved lives. The human closed his eyes for a moment, but opened them again to look at her. He said, "The war is not over, but now you know that survival is more than following orders. It is choosing who you stand with." She nodded, feeling the truth of it settle like a new foundation in her chest. Around them, the stars stretched endless and silent, and for the first time, the silence did not feel like fear. It felt like possibility. The two shuttles flew on into the darkness, carrying with them civilians, soldiers, and one wounded human, whose laughter had turned chains into choices. And though Saren did not know where the journey would end, she knew this moment would be remembered not as the day of defeat, but as the day they chose to live. The stars stretched wide and endless as the two shuttles drifted away from the burning station, their hulls scarred yet still alive with the steady pulse of engines. Inside the cabins, the civilians huddled together, whispering soft thanks and clinging to loved ones, their fear easing into fragile relief. The soldiers sat among them, their weapons lowered not out of exhaustion alone, but because for the first time they felt no order pressing them, only the weight of their own choice. Commander Saren stood near the cockpit, her eyes fixed on the man who had once been her prisoner. His leg was still bleeding, his wrists still marked with raw lines from the chains, yet he leaned back in the pilot's chair with the faintest smile, his gaze steady on the horizon of stars. She remembered the first time she struck him and how he had laughed when he should have screamed. That laugh had unsettled her, had forced her to question everything she thought she knew. Now she understood it fully. It had never been madness. It had been defiance. It had been hope. It had been a reminder that pain does not own the human spirit. She realized that his laughter had not only saved him, but had broken her chains as well. She was no longer only an officer bound to orders. She was a leader bound to the lives she chose to protect. The shuttle trembled as it passed the edge of the battlefield, but no pursuit followed. Enemy ships circled the wreckage of the station, content with their hollow victory. Saren knew that when the admirals learned of her actions, they would brand her a traitor. She also knew that she did not care. Traitor to lies, perhaps, but not to life. She had seen the truth with her own eyes, and the truth had a human face marked with scars, laughter, and defiance. The civilians began to sing softly a tune of her people that told of journeys taken through storms. Saren had not heard it since childhood, and the sound filled the cabin with warmth stronger than any command she had ever obeyed. The human listened quietly and then joined with a low hum, his voice weaving into theirs. It was strange, and yet it felt right. In that moment she knew that the war had already changed. No admiral, no fleet, no empire could erase what had been born here. The human turned his head toward her, his eyes tired yet still bright. He said survival is not victory, but it is the beginning of it. She nodded because she finally understood. The beginning was not in orders or conquest, but in choices made when everything seemed lost. She looked at the civilians, safe at last, the soldiers no longer afraid, and the stars ahead wide open. The human leaned back, closing his eyes for a moment, as though resting in the calm after the storm. His laughter still echoed in her memory, strong and alive. She knew it would echo in the memory of every soul on these shuttles. She whispered quietly to herself that they had not fled, they had chosen to live. And in that choice they had already won something greater than any battle. The shuttles sailed deeper into the night, their paths unwritten yet full of promise. Behind them the wreckage burned. Ahead of them the galaxy waited, and in the silence between stars one human laugh had changed the course of countless lives. The end.